Good evening. We'll do that again. Good evening. There you go. I like that. I'm Cleve Quinter. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement here at the Pratt. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. A couple pieces of housekeeping before we start. Conversation is going to last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for your questions, 15 minutes of your questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand and Paul will call on you. Paul, if you don't mind repeating the question, this is a hybrid program, so there's folks here and then there's folks online watching this program. That way everyone can hear it. If you're surprised that we have hybrid programs, don't be. 90% of our programs stream live, and then we archive them at our YouTube page and our Facebook page. So if there's something you missed, check it out, and it should be there. Finally, Snug Books, our book-selling partner, is here. So if you haven't purchased a book, I strongly recommend you do. Sarah, you know this very well, that you cannot get your library book signed. We prohibit it. It's a joke I've been doing for 3 years. Only new people laugh. Everybody else hates it. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome Paul French to the Pratt Library to discuss his new book, Her Lotus Year: China, the Roaring Twenties, and the Making of Wallis Simpson. In it, he traces the life of Bessie Wallis Warfield. From her humble beginnings in Baltimore, she rose to marry a man who gave up his throne for her. But what made Wallis Spencer the woman who could become the Duchess of Windsor? The answer lies in her one-year sojourn in China. Paul French was born in London and lived and worked in Shanghai for many years. His book, Midnight in Peking, was a New York Times bestseller and a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. He received the Mystery Writers of America Edgar Award for Best Fact Crime and a Crime Writers Association UK Dagger Award for nonfiction. His book, City of Devils, a Shanghai Noir, received much praise, with The Economist writing, in Mr. French, the city has its champion storyteller. Both Midnight in Peking and City of Devils are currently in development for film. Yes. Very impressed, Paul. Yes. Best-selling author Amanda Foreman wrote, Paul French has discovered a side of Wallis Simpson that few, if any, will have ever known existed. Her Lotus Year is a compelling exploration of a woman too often reduced to mere scandal, offering readers a fresh perspective on one of history's most enigmatic figures. And author Alexander Lehman relayed, Wallis Simpson's fame in China between 1924 and 1925 has been too long shrouded in rumor and innuendo. Thank God, then, for Paul French, whose magisterial, beautifully written, and impeccably researched account of the future Duchess of Windsor's activities during this period should henceforth be regarded as a definitive account. Forget the so-called China dossier, which probably never existed anyway. This is all you need to know about the woman who was never queen. It's my great pleasure to welcome Paul French to the Pratt Library.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. It's very serendipitous that I'm here because, well, it's 100 years since Wallis went to China this autumn, 1924. The book came out today in the United States and actually would have come out earlier, but the people at Barnes & Noble decided it was a Christmas book. So, although China doesn't have Christmas and Christmas isn't mentioned in the book, but they thought it would be a gift book, I suppose. So we delayed it a little while, which was fine with me, because it also meant that I would be in Baltimore for the US launch, which is really the only place to be to launch a book about Wallis Simpson, because she's probably still one of the people most associated with this city, certainly outside of America. If you had a pub quiz and said, you know, name a famous person from Baltimore, it would be Wallis Simpson, given that we don't understand American sports or anything like that. So it would be her. And also, I'm sort of partly here because I sort of feel, no one's asked me to do this, I should mention, that the British government doesn't know about this, but I sort of feel almost that I should make an apology to the people of Baltimore because, you know, the British did her wrong, right? She was stitched up, as we would say. She was done over by a combination of the Conservative government at the time, the British intelligence services, and what we now call the establishment, or if you like, the aristocracy or the elite of the country that wanted to scupper the relationship between the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII, and Wallis. So the way that they wanted to do this initially was to circulate gossip about her that made her look bad. Now, I should say that, you know, this is not like the sort of way that we see a campaign being run against Meghan Markle today. This is not in the Daily Mail sidebar. This is not in the front page of the Daily Telegraph. This is not all online with people sort of stoking up the sort of dislike. And the two sides, you know, Team Meghan and Team Kate, yes, sorry. You know, through the newspapers and social media. The great British public didn't know anything about any of this. In those days, well, still today, there is a rather pernicious thing in British society called the D notice. And the D notice can be issued by the government to prevent any reporting or any conversation of a subject that they want. And so no newspaper can report anything, no media organization can report anything, the radio or whatever. And we don't know how often D notices are issued because by definition, you're not allowed to know that a D notice has been issued. Only historically, when documents are revealed after the 50-year rule, do we find out. So the newspapers never carried any of this. And quite interestingly, very early sort of surveys in British opinion at the time found that working class people thought that Wallis and Edward should just get on with it and get married. And if they were in love, that was lovely because, you know, we're working class people. Working class is sentimental. It likes a good love story. This was really about making sure that the royal family and the aristocracy around them managed to persuade Edward that this would simply not be possible for him to marry this woman. So why could he not marry her? Well, she was, by that point, well, once divorced, about to become twice divorced. I'm not going to raise the issue of the fact that we have a queen at the moment who's divorced, and so apparently this rule has not stayed in place. That was a problem. The other problem was that she had committed one of the greatest sins anyone can commit in English eyes. She was an American. And there's no getting away from that. And very interestingly, the one person who supported the marriage as well, within the aristocracy, within the establishment, was Winston Churchill. And of course, he supported it because his mother was American, right? So he took it as a personal insult that you know, the king couldn't marry an American. And then there needed to be a bit more than that. So what appears to have happened is that a certain document was cooked up called the China dossier, although no copy of this has ever appeared. No one has ever actually admitted to having it in their hands, right up to and including the king's equerry and members of the palace and members of the royal family at the time. No one claims to have seen it. So it was a whispering campaign. There were various stories that were put about Wallis, and they decided to focus on her time in China, which was the autumn of 1924 through to the late summer of 1925. What she described as her Lotus Year, and you'll know that's from Homer, and the Lotus Year that the sailors enjoyed, shipwrecked on an island and never wanted to return home. Soporific sort of period of enchantment. The stories that they came up with were very interesting because, as I go into in detail in the book, none of them were true about Wallis, but all of them were true about someone, which is kind of interesting and shows how much thought went into this thing. They were then circulated. I'll come back to some of the stories later because I want to tell you what really happened in the year she went to China, which I think is actually much more interesting than the gossip. But I want to make the point that, one, the document sort of worked in that, you know, for instance, the woman we would now know as the Queen Mother was absolutely shocked and aghast by it. Other members of the royal family weren't very happy. It became a kind of a joke, really, though, in the circles that it circulated in, which were really the sort of Mayfair lunch set and the country house weekend set. You know, they'd have all been gossiping about it at Downton or whatever, right? So it was circulated around these people, and it was meant to sort of destroy her reputation. Wallis herself, when she heard these rumors that were going around, just said, they're just venom, venom, venom. But of course, there was nothing she could do about it. She couldn't respond to it because there was no official document and no official anything on paper. She couldn't take them to court for libel or anything like that. She couldn't respond in any way because there was no formal way to respond. She couldn't sort of issue a statement on Twitter or something like that. She was kind of just left having to suffer it, which I think if you think about it and you think about the allegations that were made about her, was quite disgusting, really. I mean, it's quite horrible for a woman to have to put up with all sorts of aspects of her supposed sex life and so on being talked about. Something that had happened nearly 15 years previously, or hadn't happened 15 years previously. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that it wasn't really very successful in the long run, because despite everyone being sort of up in arms about it and lots of jokes going around within the sort of bright young things and the flappers of the aristocracy, and the rather more prudish royal family being quite aghast, it didn't work. I mean, he abdicated and he married her, and they lived together. Now, all sorts of things happened later, and you can argue that as the Duke and Duchess in exile, they made a number of inappropriate meetings with people, and that they did some things that they really shouldn't have done. And also, you can argue about how successful or not that actual relationship was, although they stayed together, but then arguably neither of them had anywhere else to go by that point. They had really hitched their wagons together in this one. But the interesting thing, I think, is it didn't work, and they came. So, you, the jury, can decide world's greatest ever love story, or, you know, a man who didn't really want to be king finds that this is a way out, which Wallis suspected he may have done, and of course wrote several letters to him during her time when she had escaped to France, which is quite important for her China story. I'll come back to that. When she escaped to France in 1936 to get away from, by that point, what was building media intrusion, that she wrote to him and said, you know, don't do this. This is ridiculous. No one gives up a throne and an empire. And remember, the British throne and empire was something worth having in 1936, right? It wasn't like now, where it's a bit of, you know, rusty old silverware and a couple of last colonies left on somewhere that no one even knows can point to on a map. This was like really worth having. So, but he didn't. He stayed with her, and she actually wrote to him, you know, just tell me you can't do this. You've got to do your born duty and become king. And, you know, and I will just go. I will go anywhere. I will go to, and she just randomly says, but not randomly, of course, China. Right? And I thought when I read that, well, that shows that there was something going on in that year in China, that it's the first place that comes to mind when she thinks about it. So again, you, the jury, whether or not he really ever wanted to be king, whether it's something he wanted to get out of, it's quite possible that that was there. Then she couldn't get out of it, and it could have been a problem. Of course, the old Queen Mum would have said that, you know, Wallis Simpson killed her husband, right? Because Edward abdicates, George VI becomes king, you know, the one in the film with the stutter, and the wartime king, not a particularly healthy man who died quite young. But of course, others would say, well, you know, Edward would have been a terrible king, given the liaisons he had with some of the fascist leaders in Europe. He could have been a disaster. And, you know, maybe we got a lucky break there and dodged a bullet. And of course, you know, George VI's oldest child was, of course, Queen Elizabeth II. So that's why the line of progression has got us to where we are now with King Charles. Anyway, let's do the hardest part of the evening, which is the technology. Somewhere on here there's an arrow. Oh, look at that. So I just for you, I thought, well, you probably have seen a picture of Wallis Simpson before, living in Baltimore. But there she is, young. This is in the days when actually I was up there. I went for a walk up there today, 212 East Biddle Street, where she spent most of her time. She then moved to an apartment called Earl's Court. Very interesting family in the sense that, you know, very big on manners and etiquette and decorum. I mean, she was a debutante here, Baltimore being one of the places that did, the sort of European tradition of debutantes. And she was at a private school, thanks to her uncle's money, Oldfields. And I noticed recently that Oldfields has been closed or something, just recently, right? And all the stories about it at the time, because it was coming in my news feeds, they all noted the most famous old girl, alumnus, as being Wallis Simpson. So obviously she was still important there. There she is with her mother, who she lived with at 212 East Biddle Street. So lots of manners, and educated to ride a horse well. We don't think of her that way, but it's important for her time in China, actually. She does a lot of it. That she would actually, as an equestrian, but she loved to ride horses. But we don't think later, we think of her more as sort of, playing bridge till 3 in the morning, dancing and just sort of smoking constantly. But you don't think of her on horseback. But she did when she was younger. And during, there's a picture just before she went to China, actually. So that gives an idea of who she was. And I want you to bear in mind here when you think about Wallis Simpson, I'm not on a mission to convert anyone about Wallis Simpson. But what I do think is that there are, like with all of us, there are Wallis Simpsons, right? I am not the man I was at 40. I'm not the man I was at 30. I'm not the man I was at 20, right? Things have changed. Life has affected me. I've learned lessons over that time. I've made mistakes. I've done some clever things as well. But Wallis Simpson is the same. So whatever you think of the later Wallis Simpson, whatever your sort of feeling about her is, think of her as in this case tonight, as a 28-year-old woman from a family that is big on decorum, short on money, that's crowded into a house on 212 East Biddle Street, that eventually has to move from there to another building on St. Paul's Street with an even smaller apartment. But later on, in the 40s and 50s, when she was the Duchess of Windsor, of course, she was arguably the biggest celebrity in the world. I mean, given that there was no social media then, I mean, you'd have to say that she's got to be, in terms of newspaper reporting and what the Duchess of Windsor was doing, what the Duchess of Windsor was wearing, where the Duchess of Windsor was dining, whether she was at the races or going on a cruise. I mean, she's like, Taylor Swift or something in terms of just media. Like you can't get away from Taylor Swift, right? Even if you have no interest in her, you just can't get away from it. And Wallis Simpson was a bit like that, to the point that the house there on 212 Biddle Street became a kind of the very person who owned it at that time very cleverly opened it up and charged like 50 cents or something for everyone to go in and walk around a bit in there. And hundreds and hundreds of women, or thousands and thousands of women, would go there just wanting to touch a little bit of the glamour, a little bit of the wonderful life, as they saw it, of the Duchess of Windsor. Unfortunately, it's not the museum anymore, and I don't think anyone lives there now, because I went there today and I did sort of take a chance and knock on the door with 50 cents in case it was still open. So we did it, but I did appreciate a bit of inflation might have taken place, but nobody answered. So. I think it's available for rent, which I think is quite an interesting proposition. Anyway, look, let's get on with the story. So why does Wallis go to China? And why is China so important to her life, really, not the gossip? Well, the reason she went was that her first husband, Wallis Spencer, was a naval commander. He was in the Navy, but he was a flyer, right? He was like one of America's first Top Guns. And he was a very handsome man, very good-looking man. And around the time she met him in 1915, Wallis was living with her mum in a small apartment here. It wasn't really great. He seemed to offer another sort of life. Dashing, handsome naval officer that she could sort of be with. And they went off, and this is down in, when they were down now, I'm going to say this name wrong, I always do, Coronado, down on the California-Mexico border, which is where the US Navy pilots and everything had their training school. But although he was very dashing and good-looking, he was a drunk. And this had kind of semi-ruined his career. And it made him a worse drunk because in 1917, when America came into the First World War, he was not sent to Europe. He was considered a little unstable to send to Europe. He remained behind to train a new generation of pilots. Unfortunately, his brother was sent to Europe, who was also a Navy pilot, and was shot down and killed over France. So he felt that burden very strongly, that, you know, he had not gone, his brother had gone, he had died. Unfortunately, though, his way of working out that issue was to become, well, verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive towards Wallis. And this, again, is not a Wallis that we sort of hear or know about, right, as an abused woman. This is not the story that we have. The rumor is that she's this sexually vivacious sort of, you know, woman running around China. But she's not. She's an abused woman whose marriage is falling apart. Almost saving her, in fact, is that Win is posted to Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong and what was called the US Navy South China Patrol, which you've probably never heard of unless you're like a Navy nut, because it was 2 boats, 2 rust buckets, literally rust buckets. They were ships that were seized in the Spanish-American War in 1898, although they were good because they were made in Glasgow. So obviously they were good, solid engineering, but Clydeside vessels, but they were not the best ships. And also, being an American and posted to Hong Kong was not very glamorous, because Hong Kong's a Royal Navy port. And you're never going to be top dog in Hong Kong, because the Royal Navy's got 15 of its best ships in port patrolling the whole of the China coast. And Britain considers the whole of South China to be its sphere of influence anyway, right? But the Americans were there. The much better known Yangtze Patrol, and if you've seen Steve McQueen in the Sand Pebbles, you'll know the Yangtze Patrol. The Yangpat was a much more glamorous posting, because it was Shanghai, a much more glamorous place than Hong Kong. I mean, forget Hong Kong that you know today of the skyscrapers and everything else. This is pre-1949 Hong Kong. It's a Royal Navy port, and if you've ever been to a Royal Navy port town like Portsmouth or anywhere else, you'll know that you always check what time the last train gets out of the town, right? Because you do not want to be hanging around. Plus, Hong Kong was at that time pretty pestilential as well. I mean, it was just full of diseases, and everyone was always going down with cholera and tuberculosis and typhoid and everything else. And it was really not the place people wanted to go. If you were a young Brit, and you were being sent out to work for one of the great British companies like Swires or Jardines, or one of those kind of companies that are still very HSBC, that are still very active. Of course, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, still very active. You sort of held your breath when they announced your posting, because if it was, you know, Hong Kong, you just thought, oh God, I'm stuck in this Navy port, having to go home early because the pubs will all be just full of sailors fighting each other all night. And if you're unlucky, then it might be Singapore, but Singapore was always considered to be pretty boring, with sort of charitable wives making teas for you, but not much else going on, and of course just brutally hot in the days before air conditioning. And then if you got Shanghai, you won, right? That was winning the lottery to go to Shanghai in the 1920s. But Wing gets Hong Kong. He goes to Hong Kong. He doesn't like it. He's on a, as I say, a rust bucket. He's not really a sailor. He's a flyer, but they've stopped him flying because of the drinking. Wallis is in Washington, DC at that time, actually. But he writes to her after 6 months, and he says, please come out to Asia, come out to Hong Kong, because I swear I'm off the bottle. I swear I'm off the bottle. I mean, he's not the first man to have said this, I assume. I swear I'm off the bottle. Come out, we'll restart again. Her family here in Baltimore, again, as I said, manners and etiquette being everything rather than any money, said to her, well, you can't divorce him. She had wanted to divorce him. She said, you can't divorce him. We don't do that. The Warfields don't do that. And if there is a problem, it is your problem, and you should fix it. Right? That was her mother's sort of approach to this thing. So she decides to go and give it a go in genuine hope of a reconciliation. And she gets a US Navy transport, which is fairly tough in itself, 6 weeks out to Hong Kong. She's never thought of China, never thought of Hong Kong, never thought of Asia a jot in her life. It has never occurred to her to think about it. She doesn't have any interest in it. She isn't at this time interested in the aesthetics or the style of China. She's not interested in the history. She couldn't name more than 2 cities in China. She doesn't know, she's just going there. But she goes, and she gets to Hong Kong, and it's a good start. They go to Repulse Bay, which is a beautiful bay on the south of Hong Kong Island. To arrive in Hong Kong, by the way, in the 1920s was amazing. To arrive by ship in Hong Kong now is incredible. I mean, that's why everyone does the ferry when they go there, because the harbour is just so phenomenal that, you know, once you see it with the peak lying up above, Kowloon on the other side, and just shipping swarming all around the place. Well, in 1924, it was exactly like that. Ocean liners coming in and out all the time. The Royal Navy there, Wynne and his rust bucket paddling through, looking rather embarrassing. Sampans, junks, good old style junks, everything there, a buzzing harbour. But he whisks her away. Wynne meets her at the dock, whisks her away to the other side of the island, and they go to the Repulse Bay Hotel, which at that time was one of the most romantic hotels in the world. It's right on the bay, it's absolutely secluded. At night, it was absolutely beautiful. You could just sort of see the moon coming down over the sea. And it looks like things were okay. He wasn't drinking. They sort of, you know, reignited their marriage a bit. But that only lasted a week or so. And then it's US Navy appointed apartments in Kowloon side, which is the tougher side of the colony, with a Scottish landlady cooking the food with all of the skills that the Scots have in the kitchen. So, and, you know, living in that way, very, very hard. And Wynne starts drinking again. Now, a lot of the rumours around this time start, but there's also things that have never really been placed effectively. So if you go, the South China Patrol went up the coast from Hong Kong to the Pearl River and the city of Canton, now Guangzhou. At that time, there were massive strikes in Hong Kong, actually, but also in Guangzhou. And the strikes in Guangzhou were to do with political infighting and faction fighting. And there was a lot of shooting, and there were a lot of dead bodies in the street. And there was a small enclave there, a really tiny island that you can still visit today called Xiamen, which was where the foreigners were. And there was no women on Xiamen. They had all been evacuated because of the trouble. All that was there was Wynne's boat, a couple of Royal Navy boats, and a couple of French cruisers. Somehow, Wallis goes to Xiamen Island. And we still don't know exactly why she did this. And someone wanted her to go to Xiamen Island because the US Navy could not take her to Xiamen Island because the US Navy did not allow a woman, any woman, on one of its ships until 1970, right? So you could not get a woman from Hong Kong to Xiamen. You couldn't get her on there by train because of the strikes and bandits that were there. The train service was not working. The coastal steamers were also on strike, and they weren't working, and so they weren't working either. And someone arranged, I mean, this is some pull, I think, for her to go on a Royal Navy ship. The Royal Navy, for some reason, never had a problem with women coming on board the ships. And the Royal Navy took her up to Xiamen, where she stayed in the Victoria Hotel, the only hotel there, which was still partly destroyed from a bomb that had gone off earlier that year, where some Vietnamese independence activists tried to kill the visiting French governor of Indochina. She stays there for a bit. Wynne again becomes abusive, so she says. And at some point, she is put on a Royal Navy ship back to Hong Kong. Now, we don't know what happened, but at some point in Hong Kong, she ended up in hospital. Now, whether this was domestic abuse, or whether this was something that often does happen in that part of the world, that she took a dodgy ice cube or something like that upset her liver or something like that, we don't know. But it certainly led to some internal complaints that lasted the rest of her life and probably meant that she could never have children. So we don't know exactly what happened. In the rumors that have gone around, this has always been, you know, an abortion. That is sort of so nonsensical, because the idea that you would have gone into a hospital in Hong Kong to have an abortion in 1924 is absolutely insane. And yet I see quite sensible historians, right? She may have had an abortion in the hospital in 1924. And I'm just like, no hospital in the British Empire was doling out abortions in 1924. That's just not how things worked in those days. I think it's pretty much everybody knows that. Anyway, So that's the first interesting thing. Why this Charmian trip? Why not? Wynne comes back to Hong Kong. He's very unhappy about things. He starts drinking again. He wants to drag her out around sort of low bars. I mean, some people say he took her to brothels and bordellos. I don't think there's any evidence for that, but certainly kind of rough sailor bars, which she wouldn't really have wanted to go to. And he was drinking pretty heavily. He would go out, lock her in the bathroom, and go out and leave her there. In the end, she decides, once he gets physical again, I've got to leave him. I've got to go. And she thinks, if I can, someone tells her, if you can get to Shanghai, the international settlement of Shanghai, right, which is this odd sort of not quite semi-colonial presence at that time with the sort of what were called the treaty powers in control of it, including America. The British, the Americans, and lots of other countries had treaty powers from the Opium Wars. You can get a divorce there because there's an American court. So she did it. She got on a boat and she went to Shanghai. Now, I want to make clear, because this is really, really important, that in a sense what this book is about how crazy China was in 1924 and 1925. This is the year that she is there is the year that China nearly explodes into a dozen different countries. The warlords are in control of the north. Sun Yat-sen's Republican government, which has only been around for a decade or so, is just about hanging on in Canton and has no say in the north. There are warlords all around Shanghai. There are semi-colonial treaty ports in Tianjin, Shanghai, and elsewhere. When she arrives in China, Hong Kong is undergoing the worst strikes it's ever seen. Guangzhou has riots going on all over the place. Puyi is famously expelled from the Forbidden City around this time, last emperor, right? She goes up to, there's typhoid raging, there's cholera raging, there's tuberculosis. It's some of the worst time because of heavy rains for disease. During that time that she's there as well, there is eventually Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, leaving a massive power vacuum. Beijing, where she goes for quite a long time, is ruled by 7 different warlords around this time. It's constantly changing. And then, of course, the May 30th massacre in Shanghai, where a British police officer gave orders for police to fire into a crowd of Chinese protesters and killed a number, which led to anti-foreign riots all over China. It is an absolutely incredible time. And of course, the Japanese are eyeing their way into Manchuria, which of course a few years later they will take over and annex completely. The British, the French, and the other imperialists are all trying to grab a little bit more territory. And interestingly, the Americans are, dare I say it for once, the good guys in this story, right? Because they are trying to broker a peace deal between the northern warlords, who control areas of territory the size of Belgium, right, with their own private armies, and Sun Yat-sen and the Republican government, which of course came to power in 1911, ending the 267-year-old Qing dynasty. They are trying to broker a peace deal. They're actually trying to do something constructive. And this is very important for Wallis's story. This is the year that she decides to go to travel in China. So it is a year when she experiences great privilege. She's in the foreign bubble, if you like, but she also is seeing terrible things going on. Now, importantly, she never really got on with Hong Kong, and it's quite understandable why. It was a British port. Times were very hard for her. There were very few Americans there, and everything was run by the Brits with their own class system and their own rigidities and their own social ways of doing things. And as you know, that can be very tiresome and very hard to deal with. I've done it for 58 years. And they kind of, it didn't really get on with her. Then she goes to Shanghai. The first thing she finds out when she gets to Shanghai is there's not going to be a divorce, because there is an American court, but you have to have been married in Shanghai to get the divorce in Shanghai, so it can't work. But she decides to stay in Shanghai. Now, it's kind of interesting what happens from here, because, okay, she's in Shanghai. She can get a boat back to America from Shanghai. They're like they're like buses, right? They come every couple of days at that time. An ocean liner will take you back across the Pacific to America, and she could get a divorce. But she doesn't. After hanging out in Shanghai for a while and enjoying the town, not quite at its peak in 1924, but still an incredible town and a very cosmopolitan international town. None of that, lots of Brits there, but there's a kind of the whole British dominance is put to one side, and everyone is living this kind of cosmopolitan life, and that kind of the nightclubs and cabarets and salons and everything that Shanghai is known for was sort of coming along. She also, by the way, stays in probably definitely the best hotel in town at the time, the Palace Hotel. Now, this is very interesting when you track her around. She always stays in the best hotels. Yet she hasn't got much money. So how is she staying in the best hotels? Well, I think that's interesting. She then decides to go to Tianjin. Now, Tianjin's an interesting place to go because, one, she has to go there within the next couple of weeks because it's icing in. It's an ice port. So she's got to go there. And from there, she's not quite sure where she's going. But she goes with another Navy wife. And when they arrive there, the other Navy wife just takes one look at it, gets back on the boat, and goes back to Shanghai. But Wallis stays. There are people dropping dead in the street of cholera. There is a massive cholera outbreak. But she is met off the boat by a man called Clarence Gauss, who no one really notices, and he slips through in all the biographies of Wallis Simpson, but not to someone who knows their China history, he doesn't, because he was in 1924 probably the most important China hand in the State Department. He knew more about China than anyone else, and probably slightly later, maybe Owen Lattimore, who you may know, but like really Gauss was the man at the time. And Gauss was in Tianjin brokering this deal between Sun Yat-sen and the Northern warlords. But he was up against it because the place is in the grip of a typhoid epidemic, and at the same time, bandits and warlords are roaming all the way round. It's completely dangerous. I mean, the American government and the British government have got, you know, these kind of like basically no travel type warnings out on these places. But he meets her, takes her to a hotel, gets her a room, again in the Astor House Hotel in Tianjin, the city's best hotel. And he gets her onto a train. It's virtually impossible to get a train from Tianjin to Beijing. Now remember, there is still ocean liners going from Tianjin to America. If she needs to get back to America, she can get on a boat there and go back. Or she can go with her friend back down to Shanghai and go there. She doesn't. She goes 70 miles inland, which today on a high-speed train takes 31 minutes. Then would normally take about 6 hours. But because of the bandits and everything, it took about 26 hours or something. It was a long, cold trip. She gets to Beijing, she gets off the train, and she's met by a man called Louis Little, right? So you don't have to remember all these names. But anyway, Louis Little is the Marine Guard commander of the US Embassy in Beijing, which was always traditionally protected by the 4th Marines. He meets her. Why does the head of the Marine Guard, at a time when the city is under warlord besiegement by warlords, come and meet a junior naval officer's wife who, you know, has gone to Beijing and takes her to the Grand Hotel de Peking, the grandest hotel in Europe in Asia at that time, still there today on Chang'an-jie, and he takes her there and gets her a suite. No one can get a suite. Everyone, all the missionaries from the outside stations are piling in. Any rich Chinese outside, everyone is there trying to get it. There's a woman called Grace Bass Warner, who's a great philanthropist and collector of Chinese art. She's a billionaire, like Gilded Age money, billionaire from Chicago. And she has to share a room with another woman at another hotel because she can't get a room. She doesn't have the pull. Wallis Simpson walks into a suite in the best hotel in town just before Christmas in 1924. And it's amazing that she manages to do that. And there she is again. Well, what does Wallis say she was doing in the midst of a typhoid epidemic, the port icing up, warlords besieging Peking, bandits controlling the railway lines? She says she was going shopping. Believe me, nobody in December 1924 went from Shanghai on a shopping expedition to Beijing. So what was she doing? Well, my argument is, and you know, it's impossible to prove, but in those days, the situation was such that because of the warlordism across the country, the different American consulates and embassies could not speak to each other. So Clarence Gauss, who needed to talk to the embassy in Beijing, or the consulate in Shanghai that needed to talk to the embassy in Beijing, or the consulate in Hong Kong that needed to speak, and US naval intelligence that needed to pass around documents, had to do it by courier. We know that this went on. And we also know that in those days, America, as you know, was very late to set up a formal intelligence operation, right? You know, a long time after the Europeans. And what they did initially was, if they needed couriers or documents to be moved around, if you were the wife of an officer, you were considered sort of automatically cleared. You were sort of kosher, right? So it was okay for you to do it. And they would cover your hotel, and they would pull the strings that needed to be pulled, which the head of a US legation guard or senior diplomat in Tianjin could do at that time. So that's how I think she was moving around. Anyway, once she gets to Beijing, although she liked Shanghai, and legend has it she spent so much time in Shanghai, but she didn't. We then have her in Beijing. So here's some photos of her. This is by the Gate of Heavenly Peace. Sorry, I should remember that. Spent so much time walking around it, which is the sort of entranceway to the Forbidden City in Beijing. It's still there today, of course. And there she is, kind of, I don't know if that's a sort of a different Wallis Simpson to the Wallis Simpson we normally know. Howard Acton, who knew her a little bit, he said that he saw some video, like cine film of her. And he said that she was a very different Wallis Simpson. She was a slightly fuller figure than the more sort of skinny Wallis Simpson that we know later. And perhaps these photos show that that was true. Here she is on Ho Hai Lake at the back of the Forbidden City. You could go on these kind of sleds, and people would pull you around. It was a sort of fun thing for foreigners to do. So you can see that she's enjoying the sort of foreign bubble expat life. She's part of the foreign colony, the American colony of Beijing. She's slotted right in. And amazing serendipity, she's about to, obviously, American largesse only goes so far. There is a point where you have to leave your nice suite at the hotel. And just before, she bumps into this woman that you see here sitting next to her, with the headband on, Kitty Rogers, who she had known before she was a Rogers at Coronado Air Base. Her husband had been with a Top Gun as well. He had been sent to Europe. She had gone with him to be a nurse. He had been shot down and killed. She had stayed on as a nurse, and she had met a man called Herman Rogers, who was from enormous railroad wealth. Just unbelievably rich. And she married him and became Kitty Rogers. They had decided in that sort of post-war, I mean, Beijing became a sort of a minor version of the sort of lost generation in Paris for the Americans. I mean, fewer people, but there was some in Beijing as well, which is worth a book in itself, I think. But they went there and they rented a beautiful Hutong property. It's still there today, on Shejiao Hutong. Where Americans were so rich at that time, richer than the Brits and the Europeans, because you were on the silver exchange, and silver was so much better than gold at that period for some reason that's way beyond me. So the Americans had more money than anyone. I mean, there's like freelance journalists living in courtyards with their own ponies and a tennis court. Things like that. That's not how freelance journalists live now. So she stayed with them. They asked her to stay with them. That later became the subject of many rumors, which I'll tell you is nonsense, because the China dossier did that. Anyway, you can see her here, by the way. This must be summer, because she talks about wearing kimonos to try and keep cool, Japanese-style kimonos. And you can see that she's starting to develop an appreciation for Chinese aesthetics, for Chinese style, Asian style, you know, chinoiserie, if you like. And you can see there, even in 1925, which this must be, she's already got the chignon hairstyle, which her hairdresser of 30 years, Alexandra of Paris, was once asked where that hairstyle came from, and he said she learnt it in China, and I just had to replicate it. Here you can see they would go, Herman was extremely rich and also rented a temple in the Fragrant Hills, the Western Hills outside of Beijing, which was a very nice thing for foreigners to do at that time. You would go away for weekends, particularly in the summer months, to escape the heat of Beijing. And he rented the finest one in the mountains, really, called the Temple of the Black Dragon Pool. And they would go up there, and here they are, obviously in their swimming costume, looking to swim. Lots of rumors later would say that, you know, she had an affair with Herman and all the rest of it. But again, we know that that's probably not true. This one, I don't know exactly where it is, but it does show a kind of different sort of dress code that women were wearing at the time. I think it's the steps of the race club. She loved the race club, Pao Ma Chang, as it was called in Beijing. And there she is there. I don't know exactly who she's with there. Still to sort that out. Now, many rumors about who she had an affair with while she was there. One of those often is Count Ciano. It's often assumed to be Count Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law. Not true, I'm afraid. And she was also accused of having an abortion from Count Ciano. That can't be true either, because although Count Ciano was, as a young diplomat in Peking, he was not there until 2 years after Wallis had left, never to return. So the dates don't match. What is interesting, though, is that, you know, again, the China dossier that the British intelligence services cooked up always has a grain of something truth that you might think about. And this man is Alberto de Zara, Dashing de Zara, who was an Italian naval officer stationed in Beijing at the Italian legation. She had an affair with him. He was a bachelor. Everyone knew she was separated from a drunk Wallis Spencer. So no one considered it any big deal at all that they had a fling. And you can see her here again in a slight more, you know, traditionally flapperish type outfit there. And this is at the race club as well. You can see he's got his binoculars to watch the horses. There he is on his boat, cigarette, uniform. I mean, who wouldn't, ladies, right? He's very nice. He later wrote a memoir. He wrote a autobiography in which, in Italian, which hasn't been translated into English. But he writes very kindly of her. He says, you know, it was a wonderful affair. We spent some time together. I loved her. You know, I'm not going to say anything about it because her life turned out very differently. You know, he went on to become an admiral in the Italian Navy. You know, there was no recriminations, no bitterness about it. There, by the way, is her member's badge for Shanghai Race Club, which she visited as well. As you can see, Mrs. Spencer, complimentary member's badge for the race club. It's nice that that somehow survived, I think. And she made many friends that lasted a lifetime while she was there as well. This is a man called George Sebastian, who's a rather mercurial figure, but he's very important to Wallis because, and he's often misidentified in biographies of her as a friend of either Ernest Simpson, her second husband, or Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. But he was neither of those things. He was her friend. He was a Romanian count of some description, but an aesthete. And it was from him that she learned how to source good jade. And this became something that she did in Beijing to make some money. Lots of boats would arrive with various tourists during the sort of Asian version of the Grand Tour. They would do the Eastern Grand Tour. They didn't have time to go shopping themselves. She would go to the markets and the curio dealers, and she would find jade trees and jade pendants and various other things. And she would buy them from the dealers for, you know, whatever price and sell them at a markup to that. So that, and being very, very good at poker and bridge, which she was legendarily good at, was the way that she was able to fund her time. And they remained friends for a long time. I want to say all the rumors about Kitty and Herman Rogers and her and how she broke up the marriage and everything, it's complete nonsense. Here they are in France. Where did the Duke and the Duchess get married? They fled to the Rogerses by that point, being very rich, had left China and now had one of the grandest villas on the Côte d'Azur, on the Riviera in France. And that's where they went. Here they are as Herman and Herman standing next to Kitty with, that's Perry Brownlow, the King's equerry, and Wallis, obviously, Herman gave her away, as her own father was dead, and they were the witnesses on that side. Now, who does that if someone slept with your husband, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, does it, that rumour? So that one's gone. And just finally, I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures, just to show that style that she adopted in China stayed with her all her life, and she always kept it. So the idea of the Cheongsam style dress, which later she got made by Mambocher, who, despite the name, is an American designer. He made it for her, who also created Wallis blue for her as a colour. She would wear that often with Chinese traditional knotwork, all of that. And of course, she had the figure that really suited the Qipao or the Cheongsam style. She always kept the chignon hairstyle. And of course, her love of jade never went anywhere, but she stopped going to the markets and she went to Cartier in Paris, and she got it made there on the Duke's checkbook. There's a lot more I could say, but obviously you might have some questions, and I don't want to cut into that time too much. So let's end it there, and if you've got anything that's...
Again, we've got 15 minutes for your questions. If you have questions, raise your hand. While calling you, you could just summarize the question in response.
Okay. Madam.
Did she speak more than one language? Like the Romanian?
No, I mean, English was the lingua franca. She claims that she did have, Herman and Kitty had a Chinese tutor who came in, and they were trying to learn it. Herman was trying to write a book about China. We don't know what it was. It never seems to have appeared. He was terribly blocked. But he enjoyed Wallis's company. They would go out walking on the Tartar Wall, which goes around the imperial city. You could ride horses along the top of it, and she would do that. Again, as I said, not always how you think of Wallis Simpson, but she liked horse riding. She says that she attempted to learn Chinese, but didn't get very far. She had her own rickshaw puller, which was something, again, that you could afford as an American. And I think that she was, so she probably learned what we used to call taxi driver Chinese, right? Like sort of, which sort of everyone picks up after a couple of weeks if they're living in China. Yeah, so all of the dealers that she worked, the curio and antique dealers that she worked with, they all spoke English. They knew how to deal with the foreigners. And most places she went, she would have been okay. And there were, the Chinese have always, hotels and restaurants, things have always had a good grasp of English. So she didn't. There is I think, erroneous story that was told by Madame Wellington Koo. Wellington Koo was the famous foreign minister of China, and then later Republic of China ambassador to Washington and to London during the war, and Paris for a while as well. Very starred career. And he had a wife who later wrote some slightly, shall we say, bitchy memoirs about everyone. So she's now writing this in the sort of 1940s. So the position of her, and like her husband's had to go to Taiwan and everything, right? Because his side lost, Chiang Kai-shek's side lost. And the position of Wallis have kind of reversed. And the idea that she would have remembered Wallis so clearly is slightly odd. I get things all the time. There was someone online today who said to me, my grandmother met Wallis in Hong Kong and wasn't impressed. And I'm like, I get that so often, and I really don't think your grandmother did meet Wallis. I don't. It's very unlikely. Who would remember meeting her, right? It's like she's just a random person at this time. She's not famous at all. Anyway, she said her line on it, Madame Wellington Koo's, was, all she ever learned in Chinese was, "Boy, bring me more champagne," which I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, there is a Chinese for that, but yeah, I mean, if you were at an embassy legation or something like that, you could probably just say, "Boy," which is of course condescending, but was the language of the time. "Boy, bring me more champagne" would have been fine. So there was always a tendency later on to start, people tell all sorts of stories about her, and they just grow and grow and build, and again, there's not much you can do about it, really. Sir.
I'm trying to get it clear in my mind, I suppose, in a neat, concise nutshell. Why did she stay in Shanghai, or why did she stay in China when it was very plain and obvious to her that her marriage to Winfield Spencer had failed? Why didn't she return to the USA? Why did she remain in China when she didn't want that marriage to Winfield Spencer anymore? Why didn't she come home? After listening to you, it almost seems to me that she stayed there very simply because she wanted an adventure.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a good question, and I think it was a chain of circumstances. So I think we know she goes to Shanghai first of all because she thinks she can get a divorce there. That wasn't a totally stupid thing to think, because the international treaty extraterritoriality laws in Shanghai were very odd. Right, then she could have got on a boat and come back. But then I think the US Naval Intelligence or the State Department asked her to go to Tianjin. And when she got to Tianjin, where she could get a boat home, right, she was asked to go to Beijing. And I think that there was an inducement there, some cash, or, you know, like, I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It was just she was offered, get on a train and go there. She obviously had a sense of adventure. And she goes to Beijing. I mean, I don't think she could have done it on her own. Clarence Gauss, who arranges it, not only arranges the train ticket for her and the hotel for her, but he has a Marine sit on the train to keep her seat, because people at that time are stealing each other's seats and it's all chaos. He has a Marine do that. So, you know, you don't do that for just, I mean, it would be lovely to think the State Department offered that sort of privileges for Americans when they were traveling, wouldn't it? But, you know, I'm afraid to tell you, it doesn't really work like that. So, I think that then when I think she got to Beijing, she maybe thought, well, I'll go back to Tianjin and get a boat home. She doesn't say whether she did or not. Maybe she thought that. Then she meets Kitty Rogers and Herman, and their courtyard home is beautiful. They've got loads and loads of room. It's one of the beautiful hutong, you know, the laneways, the alleyways of Beijing. They've got a temple in the hills. They've got plenty of room for her. She can, you know, there is a social set. And the important thing is that she starts to mix in a cosmopolitan social world that she's never really experienced before. She's dining at the Italian legation. She's playing tennis at the British legation. She's going to the swimming pool at the American legation. She's mixing with Romanian jade fanciers. You know, she's mixing in an international cosmopolitan society that she's never mixed in before, which I think is really important, because 12, 13 years later, when she's invited to Windsor Castle for a party that weekend, she's not that Baltimore girl anymore, right? She's not that woman that was at Coronado Air Base, right? She is now a cosmopolitan international woman. She can go to Windsor because she's been to the legations of Beijing and so on. So I think she hung around for a bit. She sort of keeps thinking of going, but the times are good. But then things do get bad after the death of Sun Yat-sen and then the May 30th massacre. The May 30th massacre and the anti-foreign riots largely targeted the British, and the American community divided in two. There were those that on their rickshaws or cars flew the Stars and Stripes and said, yeah, but we didn't do that, right? And then there were others who said, no, we have to show solidarity as foreigners in the face of this. But she had some experiences. Someone graffitied her rickshaw when she was in there, sort of, you know, saying Americans go home or something like that. So it started to, you know, the fun went out of it, right? There was always this going on. I mean, when she's in Shanghai, she talks about, you know, going to nightclubs and things, but then she sees there's the Jiangxi-Zhili war going on outside. Two warlords are battling away. And she sees trains coming into Shanghai with dead and wounded soldiers on, gangrenous soldiers and everything. So she knows that this horrible war is going on. And she sees crates of armaments going out to the warlords with made in Germany, made in Britain, and all that going out, right? So she's aware of this. when she's in Charmian, she's aware that there's barbed wire around the whole place and gunboats there to protect the foreign enclave. And when she's in Beijing, when she's in the temples at the weekends, the men all have guns with them because there are marauding AWOL warlord troops around who might come and try and steal from you or kidnap you or something. So it's not as if she's completely in a bubble. But then I think, you know, the fun really goes out of it at that point. She says, right, I turned 29. And she felt that that was a big moment. She was approaching 30, and this needed to get sorted. So the combination of, I've had my kind of Lotus year. I could stay here and do this for longer, but maybe the situation's not going to get better, and, you know, maybe, you know, or I just go back and get this sorted out. And she made the decision to go back and get it sorted out. It took a little while longer to get the divorce, but yeah. So I think that that's what happened. It was a combination of approaching 30, situation in China becoming really quite dangerous.
She tired of the adventure.
Yeah, probably. She'd been moving around for quite a while. The affair that she'd had kind of puttered out.
Also, there was a puzzling source of a great income that we referred to.
No,
It took money to live, and it seemed that where was this enormous income?
no, she was okay for that because she had a little bit of payment from Wynne as a sort of stipend from his wages that had to be paid to her, direct from the Navy. She had some money. Her famous aunt here left her some money, which she had. And then she says that Herman staked her $50 one night for bridge, and they played bridge every night. It was insane, right? Everybody played bridge too. And the thing that she was, her superpower at this point, if you had one, was the ability to stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning in a room full of smoke playing bridge, right? And she kept that superpower to the end of her life, apparently. But he says that she soon made the $50 back, and then more and more and more. And she was making a little bit on the jade dealing and the curio dealing as well. She was living rent-free, so she didn't really need much. She didn't have much day-to-day expenses. Life was cheap, you know, purchasing power parity in China was ridiculously cheap at that time. So servants and everything were a matter of pennies, really. So yeah, I mean, she wasn't becoming like super famous, although there's things that she bought there, like Chinese screens, little ivory elephants, little lacquerware boxes that followed her all through her life. She sent them back to the United States Cargo. And if you look at pictures of when she first moved to London and lived in Bryanston Square in Marylebone and by Regent's Park, and then later, of course, in the Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne, where they sort of lived in exile for a long time, you can see them on the tables. And behind them when they have photographs done. Those objects followed her all through her life as well. So I don't think it was really a question of great wealth. It was advantageous to be in that place at that time. She didn't have to pay any taxes. And, you know, she didn't need that much to live on. Sure, sir.
What's your personal view of Wallis Simpson? I know you researched writing that was done by Richard Justice. Really, I can't wait to read the book. But personal view of it.
Well, when I initially started the book, like other books that I've done, I'm always doing things that are about China. And they're always about that intersection of rumor and gossip and fact and fiction and supposition and what we can do, whether it's, you know, Midnight Peking, which was about a murder in 1937, or City of Devils, which was about American and European gangsters in Shanghai. And of course, you know, you can never quite get to the bottom of things because gangsters lie, murderers don't get caught, all these sort of things. What I'm always looking for is stories that allow me to give you a Chinese history lesson without you really knowing it, right? So you think you're reading a book about Wallis Simpson, but what it's really about for me is 1924, 1925 China, right? Which I think is an absolutely pivotal year in China's history. It could have all blown apart. And we now have a kind of idea of China as this unitary, monolithic whole, right? And the party, of course, over there is very, very keen to push this all the time. Well, of course they are, because they understand how fragile it has been at various points. And you know, it was again in 1937 with the Japanese attack. It was again in 1949 with the end of the Civil War and Chiang Kai-shek's debunking to Taiwan. It almost broke apart, arguably, in the Cultural Revolution as well. But 1924, 1925, it could have broken apart quite easily, I think. And China could look more like Central Asia does today. And the whole of that, the history of that region would have been very, very different. So I think that's really important. The fact that we have Wallis Simpson there, and there's a few things that need to be corrected about the general urban legends about her, also gives us a way into it to see one person traveling through that world, and to understand as well that, you know, she was traveling through a very dangerous place at a very dangerous time. So my view on Wallis Simpson was, I started out never believing, living in Shanghai for a long time, and everyone who came through Shanghai goes, so what's that Wallis Simpson story about? I'm going to use the phrase, I'm sorry, the Shanghai grip, right? If you don't know what the Shanghai grip is, you're just going to have to look it up, I'm afraid, because I'm not going to have that on a YouTube channel for the rest of my life. And of course, that's just made up, right? 10 years previously, people in America and Britain have been very worried about women marrying, you know, they've been obsessed with sheikhs and the idea of the Arab prince and the Egyptian prince. And then they use the term Cairo grip then, or Cleopatra's grip. You know, this is a phrase that gets used in different ways. So you know, I always knew that that was a bit of a nonsensical thing. And then people would say, like, well, what about the naked photos she's supposed to have done? And I'm like, well, show me one. And no one can ever show you one. And of course, that is, you know, in the book I explain why that couldn't have been true, because the person who's supposed to have done it was never there. You know, was she fronting for gambling rings? Well, no, not unless you call bridge night round Herman and Kitty's a gambling ring. Was she fronting for an opium ring? And funnily enough, one of the things that never comes up is opium with her, actually. But I'm pretty sure she might have had a little puff. But I mean, you know, who wouldn't in 1925 in China, right? But she doesn't actually say. So there are all these stories. But what I hadn't realized when I started was I'd realized all this hadn't happened. But I hadn't known that her initial reason for running from Hong Kong to Shanghai was that her husband beat her up. Right? I didn't know that. And that, I think, changes your perspective on her quite a lot. I mean, that's like an aspect of her that, you know, you Google Wallis Simpson domestic abuse and you'll get nothing back. Right? It's like a story that's just never told. And she glosses over it a little bit in her own memoirs because, you know, she wrote them in the 50s and people didn't really do that. But it's quite, you know, that's what happened. It's later been sort of shown. So, yeah, I became quite sympathetic to her. And I also thought she was gutsy and kind of got into it. If you follow my argument that she was couriering for the US Naval Intelligence or the State Department, and my argument on that is, if you don't think that's what she was doing, explain her itinerary in another way, because as this gentleman here said, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because she should want to go back. Why is she going where she's going? Then, you know, perhaps we should be lauding her as a true American heroine, right? Rather than a much maligned, you know, king stealer. Okay. Thank you.
During the program, I also did a little research. 212 East Middle Street sold